Well, hello, welcome to Wednesday evening. I'm going to try something a little different for a few Wednesdays here, so give me your feedback and see what you think. Thought I would try maybe looking at some more historical issues that impact our biblical world, and really specifically more the New Testament. But anyhow, I want to try a few weeks of this, so give me your feedback and tell me what you think. If this is not useful, then that's fine. We can move on to something else. But I've always enjoyed history, and I feel like that a lot of times history helps to help us understand things a little better. So we'll give this a try and see what you think. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about is there was a man named Alexander the Great, and I'm sure you've heard that name. And I guess let me get the disclaimer in. I'm going to be painting in very broad strokes. So there's lots of ways that we could, I'm sure historians and all could quibble over what I'm going to do, but all I really want us to do is kind of pick up the broad picture of things. So with that little disclaimer in, what in the world, though, does Alexander the Great have anything to do with, say, the New Testament world or the ancient world? Well, Alexander the Great, he died in 323 BC at about 33 years old. But after the death of his father was Philip II, and he was Macedonian, although, and I think this is kind of one of those little areas where they would all disagree. In other words, he would consider himself Greek. He's Macedonian. Macedonia is north of Greece, or what we would call Greece today. Greece really was a bunch of city-states. It wasn't one united country like we would think of it today. It's a lot of city-states, but they shared a lot in common in terms of, there were different dialects, but you had the Greek language, and there was a lot of commonness to the Greek culture. And like I say, there was some dispute, like if you were from Athens, you probably wouldn't consider the Macedonians pure Greeks. They were kind of I don't know, a little more barbarous, I don't know, they just weren't quite as good type of thing. But anyway, but Alexander the Great, after his father died, he took his father's place. And one of the things that Philip's father wanted to do, the major empire at that time to the east of Macedonia was the Persian Empire. And that was the major empire. And the Persians had made incursions into Greece. And like that's where the Battle of 300, the 300, where the 300 Spartans took their stand at the pass and held off the Persians and all that sort of stuff. That's where those stories come from. But the Persians still made some inroads, and there were times when they burned Athens and things like that. And so one of the things that Philip wanted to do, Alexander's father, was to basically go defeat the Persians. And Alexander took that on as his mission after his father's death. And after he had subdued the rest of the Greek city-states and kind of forcefully gotten them on board with his plan, he went over and went on this, for about a 10-year period, this campaign that took him almost really kind of to the edge of India, down into Egypt. He went through, I guess, what we would call the Bible lands, Israel, and he conquered a pretty good-sized area and did it in a relatively short period of time. In other words, but when he died at the age of 33, I mean, he had accomplished a lot, and he had done, more than most people ever would in a lifetime or several lifetimes. So, and of course, if you read the book of Daniel, you'll see that while Alexander's not mentioned there by name, it's pretty clear that Alexander is one of those empires that comes into being. So anyhow, but one of the things that I wanted to do here is kind of give us some insight. There's an interesting little verse in Galatians 4, chapter 4, verse 4, that talks about in the fullness of time. Now, I'm using the old King James language there, I believe. That's what I grew up with. Your version may have something different, when the time was ready or something. But you've got this idea of when the fullness of time, God sent Christ into the world. And, kind of looking back, and again, this is all interpretive. I'm sure there are other historians. Well, I'm not even a historian. There are historians that would pick this apart. But I can't help but look back and see how that there was something special going on in terms of preparing the world where it would make it easy for the Christian message to be spread. And I want to go over a few of these things, and a lot of these come from a teacher I had named Everett Ferguson, so go ahead and give him credit for some of these ideas. He was the one who first introduced me to these and kind of got me reading and learning in this area. But one of the things you see is you see the spread of Greek culture. One of the things that Alexander took with him, and of course after Alexander's death, it all got divided up among his generals, so the Greeks in many ways were still running things. Now the generals all didn't get along, they fought against each other, but they did wind up with certain regions that they controlled. So the Greeks stayed in power for a long time after that. Really, they stayed in power until the Romans came east and conquered and took all of that. But for a long time, the Greeks stayed in power, and so you had the spread of Greek culture, which kind of leads to a common way of thinking. Cultures have ways of thinking that sometimes can be very different from each other. And so this kind of laid the groundwork for some common ways of thinking about things. And I'll elaborate on this a little bit more shortly, like in terms of some common ideas and ways that it affected things. But what you saw is you started to see the spread of Greek culture. And sometimes you hear this called Hellenism. The Greeks would have really probably not called themselves Greeks, they would have called themselves Hellenes. But you see the spread of Hellenism and a Greek culture and a Greek way of thinking. One of the things that you also saw is that I don't think it was originally intended this way, but it ended up kind of helping with the kind of establishing when I say a world economy, the world back then, that Mediterranean basin area, it kind of helped with the economy. In other words, Alexander had to pay his soldiers, and anytime you're running a military operation, you've got to pay bills, you've got to have money. And so he created a standard for coins. And the drachma, the tetradrachma, I think you've heard of those. You see those pop up sometimes in your reading. But he established a coinage. And it was supposed to have a certain amount of silver in it, and in other words, there was a standard to it. Now, yes, there were always counterfeiters that tried to go by that, but if it was money printed by Alexander or by those Greeks that came after him, they tried to maintain a standard because he had to pay his army. And so what happened is that it kind of led to an acceptance, and it made trade and exchange of money a little easier. It helped move things along economically in terms of creating a little bit more of a world economy. You knew that if it wasn't counterfeit, this had a certain amount of silver in it. See, the reality was it didn't really matter as much which mint turned it out, is were they adhering to the Alexandrian standard. And so, but because he would pay his soldiers and he would pay, he may pay off local officials or things like that, it kind of lent itself towards helping the world economy along. So you see that going on. In other words, what you're starting to see, I'm getting at here, is you start to see some standardization in some things across that whole Mediterranean basin and the things that are there. Another thing that you'll see that's important was the spread of the Greek language. Probably the easiest way I could explain this is, I think in that day, Greek would have been very similar to what English is today. It's my understanding, and if I'm wrong, correct me on this in the comments, but if you're going to be an international commercial pilot, you have to speak English. All international airports, that is the language that the control tower is going to speak, and as a pilot, you have to be able to speak that. It's kind of become the international language of flying. Greek was that way. In other words, and now there were dialects, but by the time you come down to the time of Jesus in the first century, there was a Greek, and today it's called Koine, which really I think just kind of means common. It was the common language, and it's that common Greek that the New Testament was written in. It was that Koine Greek. And what I'm getting at there is that it created a common language for people all in that Mediterranean, all around the Mediterranean, that they could speak and kind of understand each other. It created an international language. And in fact, one of the little side notes to that is that it was called common in that it was the everyday spoken Greek. It wasn't high educational Greek or things like that. It's kind of like if you you can hear some people speak and you can tell, oh, they're an academic. Look at the words they use, that sort of thing. This wouldn't have been written in that kind of language. This was the common, everyday language. The New Testament was written in everyday, every man's language so that everybody could understand it. And again, let me emphasize that because see, by the time you come to the New Testament and the writing of the New Testament, the political power is Rome. The language of Rome is Latin, and the Romans control that whole Mediterranean area. And yet, what is the language that the Bible's written in? It's written in Greek. So it gave a common language to a lot of people. And I'll talk about the Septuagint later in another video, but that's one of the reasons why the Septuagint, or you'll sometimes see it called LXX, the Roman numerals for 70, it was a translation from Hebrew into the Greek language, because as really Greek became the main language spoken, you had a lot of Jews that, because they were no longer living in Jerusalem or in the Promised Land, they really didn't speak a lot of Hebrew or may not speak any at all, and they spoke Greek, and so they wanted the scriptures, or their Old Testament, what we would call Old Testament, they wanted their scriptures in the language they could read, and that was one of the reasons for the translation of the Septuagint. So anyhow, but you have the spread of the Greek language, and if you think about it, like with Paul, that made it easier for him to travel all around and be able to speak to people. And yeah, I know there was the gift of tongues, and that was used sometimes, but in a much more common and mundane way, it allowed Paul to go about wherever he wanted to and speak, and they would be able to understand him more than likely because Greek was so common. You start to see a common body of ideas accepted by all. The Greeks, I mean, there's no doubt they were very smart. I mean, you could just walk back through, the Greeks and what all they did. I mean, everybody I think has probably heard of Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, and they're still studied to this day. I mean, there are those dedicated to the study of Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. There are still Aristotelians today, and those that take Aristotle very seriously, and for good reasons. He was a very smart man. There's a lot you can learn from him, if for no other reason, learning how to learn. But it started to create a body of ideas that were accepted by all. You start to have some common things. And while education and literacy rates would not be as high back then as they are today, or at least in the United States, one of the things you see is that you do start to see a higher level of education. The Greeks promoted education, and while it may in some cases be a little more rudimentary, you had higher educational levels because of Greek culture. Greek culture valued education and learning. In fact, as the Romans expanded east, when the Romans started coming east and conquering those areas, a lot of times if a city or a people or an area resisted them, they would conquer them. And then one of the ways that the Romans would do things is they would take slaves. And they would just enslave everybody. Slavery back then was not a racial thing. It was not based on race. You could be any race, anything. Slavery was just, you were taken into slavery. And like I say, a lot of times the Romans, that's one of the ways they would do it, is when they went to an area, if the area resisted, they'd defeat them and they'd take a lot of slaves out of there. And the slaves would be taken back to Rome or wherever and sold. And very often, the slaves, you could have somebody with a high educational level that was a slave. You might have a slave, and a Roman would buy this slave because this slave had a higher educational level than them. They might be more educated, and then one of the things they would do is use them to educate themselves or their children. You might buy a slave. If you were a rich enough Roman, you would buy a slave so that slave would educate your children. And so it would have not been unheard of for a slave to have higher educational and literacy rates than the master that owned them, because the Romans would buy them. So I'm not justifying the slavery. I'm just saying that's the way things were done. But the Greeks valued education. So you start to see higher educational levels that are there. You start to see the spread of the Greek gods. In other words, as the Greeks went into areas, a lot of times local gods or deities would be renamed after the Greek gods. And so there was that mixing that went on. But there tended to be, and even today, people still go back and study the Greek myths about the gods, the Greek gods and the Greek myths, that sort of thing. But you started to see a lot of commonality there. You see the emergence of philosophy as a way of life. And in other words, you would have, you see this mentioned in the New Testament, at least in Acts 17, when Paul's at Athens, for instance. You got the Stoics, you had your Epicureans. And in other words, there were ways of living. In other words, different philosophical schools promoted different ways of living, how to have a meaningful or the best life, or how you should live life. And so you see these rise of philosophical schools that are going on. And what that means in a way is that there becomes kind of an openness to maybe rethinking the way of living from what you've been taught. Because what I'm trying to get at there is that previous to this, you just wouldn't really change your way of living or your way of thinking. You wouldn't change it. It was just whatever it was with your family, and that was still there in the ancient world, even in the time of Jesus, but there was a little more openness with the Greeks to saying, you know what, maybe I need to listen to this over here. And see, that's what you see like in Acts 17, again, when you go there. It mentions that the Greeks there just spent all their time listening to new ideas. In other words, maybe there's something new, maybe there's something we need to learn. And in other words, like you had in the ancient world, like Paul would have probably been seen when he first came to town, at least by Greeks and those that weren't that familiar with it. He's another traveling philosopher. He's here to sell his philosophy or his way of thinking or, his sort of thing. So you would see that go on. But it opened the door to maybe thinking about and looking at other ways of life and other ways of living. In other words, one of the things that you see in the New Testament is Paul would go to a city, and he would have probably been viewed very much like one of these traveling philosophers, those that were there. So that would have been something common, and there would have been those that would have listened and that sort of thing. But you do see the emergence of philosophy as a way of life, and it's people questioning the old traditions and the old things and the old ways of thinking. And so it kind of presents, or it creates an openness to new ideas, and maybe I need to do this, and maybe I need to do something different from what my family has done before me. And of course, that's in some ways, that's what Christianity was. It was a break with the past for some people. You see the importance of city life. Yes, the life of the city becomes more important. And one of the things Alexander did as he traveled around in his conquering is he would establish cities. The most famous city that he established was Alexandria on the north of Africa there. But he established a number of cities, and then of course his generals that divide his kingdom up after him established a number of cities. In fact, there was more than one Alexandria. Just the Alexandria in northern Africa is the most famous. But you saw the rise in the importance of city life. And like, let me give you an example of how this would play into. In other words, the cities become economic areas. People come there. There's trading going on, lots of traveling, that sort of thing. And like in the New Testament, one of the things you would see, if you'll remember from the book of Acts, Paul spends a good number, he spends a good number of days or time there in Ephesus. And it's in Acts 19 that it's noted that now what they call Asia would have been what we call, Asia or Asia Minor would have been Turkey today. So that's kind of helps you place Ephesus on our map today if it helps. But it talks about all the people of because of Paul's work in Ephesus, all the people in the province of Asia got to hear the gospel. In other words, Paul established himself there. It was the school of Tyrannus. And he was able to teach and promote and spend some time there doing some things. And it's probably quite likely, for instance, like the Colossian church. That's how it was established. There's a man named Epaphras that Paul mentions. In other words, when Paul writes his letter to the Colossians, you pretty strongly get the idea Paul didn't establish that church and he hadn't been there. So yet how did that church get established? How do these people see Paul as an authority figure, or that he feels like he can write a letter to them? It's because probably Paul was the one that taught and trained this Epaphras, and then Epaphras would go and was probably kind of a traveling preacher. And he was one of the ones that helped establish the church there in Colossae. So in other words, because of the travel that was possible and city life and the things going on, Paul was able to stay in one location and yet have an impact all over a big area. So that's part of the reason why city life becomes important. Paul could go, and by and large, that's where Paul would go. He would go to the cities, and he would work there, and he could get a lot of good done. Because the cities were these places that everybody came. Lots of travel, lots of movement, that sort of thing. So you see the importance of city life. Another thing that you see, and this ties into something we talked about earlier, is the rise of individualism. It's not that people still didn't view themselves as part of a group. There's kind of a mix there. But you start to see where the individual becomes more important. And now this is kind of a overstatement, but there's some truth to it. Like if you looked at the ancient world, you would see for the Greeks, they would tell you, kind of the way of thinking in Greek culture is man is the measure of all things. Man is the one that decides what's right or what's true, that sort of thing. Now see, like if you'd gone to the Persian culture, further east there, probably this would have been the standard. The king is the measure of all things. Whatever the king says goes. And like to tie it into biblical, see, for Jewish thinkers and therefore for Christian thinkers, God is the measure of all things. So can you kind of see how these cultural emphases, and of course, this is one of those things that clashed. Later, when we talk about the Jews and the Maccabees and that sort of thing, one of the things you're going to see is that within Judaism, there was kind of a civil war that was going on between those that really wanted to accept Greek culture and those that did not. And probably one of the primary things about this is for instance, is man the measure of all things or is God the measure of all things? Which is it? You see. But you do see the rise of individualism. But again, this plays into that idea that because you're an individual, you can think and decide for yourself. So, and then, of course, and again, this is very broad strokes, but what happens eventually is that Rome starts expanding east. They start coming east and they start taking the Greek areas. They defeat these generals, in essence, or the descendants of the generals of Alexander. And they take over all of that area and they then rule it. And one of the things that moves that along is the Romans then, they really do at least a couple of things, one of which the Romans were great road builders. You can still see these Roman roads today and walk on them. You can, if you want to, you can walk the same road that Paul would have walked if you want to do that today. And now I think, as I understand it, one of the primary reasons for building roads for the Romans is it allowed them to get their military somewhere in a hurry. If they had to get somewhere in a hurry to fight, they can get their military there. But these roads were also used for commerce, for travel. I'm gonna go ahead and say this, and again, I can be corrected in the comments, but in the history of the world up to that time, probably travel, when the Roman Empire came into its own from the, really from Augustus going forward even into the 2nd century AD, travel was probably easier at that point in time than it had ever been in the history of man. The ability to get somewhere if you wanted to. And you notice this in the New Testament. Paul travels. He put a lot of miles on doing things, going places, traveling by sea and by land, doing both. So travel was probably the easiest it had ever been for mankind up to that point with what the Romans did. They built roads. They built roads well. Hey, little side note, if you're interested, there's an interesting little series, you can find it now on YouTube, about walking the Roman roads in Britain. If you're into history, it might be worth checking out. If you're not, that's fine, but I'll just throw that in there as a great little side note. But I've been enjoying some of those episodes about just walking the Roman roads in Britain, because wherever Rome went, they built roads. But it allowed for travel. It allowed for a guy like Paul to be able to travel and move about and go all over the place and do things. And the other thing that Rome brought about, like I say, especially with Augustus, going forward, sometimes the expression is called the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace. And it provided a stability. It's not that there wasn't fighting and some wars going on, but by and large, it provided for a good number of years, I'm going to say a couple hundred years, relative peace and stability in the Mediterranean area. And again, that allows for the expansion of something like Christianity to go forward. So you had this kind of peace that Rome brought, or stability that allowed Paul to travel around. And of course, if you remember, Paul was a Roman citizen, which gave him some extra special privileges and things. But it allowed him to travel all over this world back then, and travel freely and easily and with some rights, and made it possible. So anyway, we'll talk about some other things that impact, but you can really kind of see, and at least to my way of thinking, you can see the hand of God in preparing the world, like it says in Galatians 4, when the fullness of time came. In other words, kind of a sense in which the world was ready. This was as good a time as you were ever going to have to bring Christ into the world, because his followers, the disciples of Jesus, could go forward and could disciple and convert people in ways that really hadn't been possible previously in the history of the world. So anyhow, I hope you found this interesting. Again, please feel free to either leave a comment or contact me. But I'm going to try some of these historical things for a few weeks and see how you like those. Anyhow, I hope the rest of your week goes well, and I'll see you guys again, well, at least in video. I'll see you guys again on Sunday. Take care.